All right, the recording has started, and this is the September 3rd, 2019 Crossplane community meeting. We have a big milestone that's coming up very soon, so we will dive into a bit of a review and status update on the 0.3 milestone and to see where we are with that and status and risks associated with that. Let me bring up the participants list here to see who all is on the call. It looks like we're missing a couple of engineers that have items assigned to them in 0.3, but we'll do our best to get an accurate status. So I took a pass this morning through the 0.3 milestone and tried to clean up some of the issues there and get things into the current status as reflected in reality. And so one of my biggest observations from going through the 0.3 milestone this morning was that there are a lot of the quantity of items and issues on the board right now is pretty high, or in the milestone. But when I took a deeper dive into them, I noticed that about 10 of them are actually epics, the things at the epic level, which have associated features with them, but don't themselves necessarily have work associated with them. So these epics here are, they have a spot in the milestone, but the real work is for them is being tracked by all these individual issues. That's one observation. The next observation I had is that a bulk of the engineering work here is around resource connectivity, modeling networking connectivity types for each of the cloud providers, and being able to provision and configure those networking types using Crossplane in order to create a securely connected example of like an application talking to a database, et cetera. That was a huge focus for this milestone. And so all of those have pull requests open and are converging towards getting ready to merge to master. And that covers probably, amongst those 3 pull requests across the 3 cloud providers, probably covers like 15 issues by itself. So a fair amount of these issues are in flight. And then the final observation I had is that we have maybe about 6 or so issues open for polishing and cleaning up all the effort around stacks, developer experience, automation, and examples and stuff like that. So the quantity of issues on the board really concerned me this morning. But in terms of where things are in progress and how we're tracking things, I feel fairly confident about where we are and how many things are about to close soon. I mean, yeah, we can always have the discussion about work in progress limits, et cetera. But we can do that as a retrospective, maybe after the milestone. Okay, so I wanted to get quick status from everybody, so it's on the call here, on where we are with certain implementations, et cetera. So Muafak, you're on the call. Do you want to give us a quick update, buddy, about the GCP resource connectivity and stuff?
Yeah, sure. So right now we've got the types and tests and everything. There was some comments from Nick lately. I just fixed them and pushed a new commit. So I think today we will be able to merge that PR. So we've got those types, and the other epic is like updating the WordPress example, which is what I'm taking on this week.
Awesome, cool, man. So it sounds like then the feedback on the pull request has been integrated, and we're looking to potentially merge that today, which is great. That's really good news.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome, man. Okay, then let's, I don't see Javad on the call, to give us an update on AWS, but I did see the pull request over the weekend here that Javad has all of the, there's like 7 or 8 different types to represent resource connectivity in AWS, because AWS doesn't like necessarily to do things in a simple way. But Javad has controllers and types for all of those now. And I believe since they're following the managed reconciler pattern, that they are fully featured as well with all the CRUD operations. I saw that, so Nick provided some feedback on the pull request, and Javad is integrating it. I think the big thing that's missing here for AWS is tests still. So we may need to do some shuffling around to be able to pick up the tests, the test work for AWS, because there's a strong possibility that Javad is going to be out the rest of the week and maybe next week, some of next week as well, for a wedding that he's not only involved in, it's his wedding. So that's fairly important. So we may need to do a little pickup of the finish off the tests and get that to the finish line here. But I know we're fully capable of doing that. Not worried about that. Dan, do you want to give us an update on all things Azure?
Yeah, absolutely. So all functionality has been implemented. That PR is still in draft because I have 2 managed reconciler tests that I am finishing up this morning. So I just wanted to make sure that wasn't merged before those were completed. But it's ready for review. There's a couple of follow-up things that I'll probably open issues on that can be addressed in the future, just in terms of how we're doing some of the defaulting and that sort of thing for Azure. But as far as the network connectivity, it's all been tested and ready to go. I do still need to verify like end-to-end with WordPress. So actually deploying it to the AKS cluster and making sure that it connects to the database and everything like that. I have been able to verify connectivity between the AKS cluster and the database using a tool that Azure has. So it seems that everything's good to go and that's ready for review. So I will have those tests done probably around lunchtime today, and then I'll take the draft status off that PR. And I'm also happy to help out with any of those tests on AWS.
Right on. Awesome, man. Great progress on that. So that's good. So then that sounds like then that the 3 different cloud providers, their stacks and the source connectivity is largely towards, getting, like, they all have pull requests open. They, the AWS tests are a bit of a concern. But the functionality seems to be there, and feedback is being incorporated on the pull requests. And so we seem to be converging on those early this week, which is good, which gives us time through the rest of the sprint until next Friday to update the user guides and the documentation and the walkthroughs and everything to have a nice, smooth experience for any user of the 0.3 release to be able to use these cloud provider stacks and set up the full WordPress example, talking to a database and all that sort of stuff. Is Suskin on the call? No, it does not look like he is. So I'll give an update for the Stacks CLI in his WordPress and the WordPress stack. So Daniel has implemented a command line interface experience via a Kube Control plugin to initialize, build, publish, install, and uninstall a stack, which is great to have that full experience there to get it off the ground and running, and then develop it and publish it, and then actually install it into a cluster as well. So that is a good progress. I'm feeling really good about that there. And the WordPress stack is fully implemented. And I think really what's left there is taking that WordPress stack and working with across the rest of the cloud provider implementations to get the documentation, default resource classes, everything there to be a smooth experience all around. So that's kind of going to be a bit of a shared responsibility to make sure that we are updating our documents and our examples, et cetera, so we can make it as smooth as possible for the 0.3 release, and then also making sure we're not duplicating work across those as well, since Suskin wants to have a hand in, or should have a hand in that as well, being the owner of the WordPress stack. So that seems to be in a good place. Marcus, you had a big PR merge on Friday. Do you want to give us an update about the Stack Manager?
Sure. There were a couple revisions made to the stacks design, including renaming it from extensions to stacks. And along the way, we've added the concept of UI annotation or UI description files being added to a stack that can be used by any sort of development tools down the road. And what we've done in these merged PRs is allowed for additional metadata files like a resources.yaml, a group.yaml, UI schema YAML to become annotations in the deployed CRD, so that when a stack has been installed, the CRDs that are managed by that stack, you can get a little more information about them, about the stack that's controlling them. And so that leads to probably the next item in here, which is a comma list, I think, on your bulletins, right? Yeah, packaging, annotations, and security, which leads us to that part, I think, unless there's anything else you think is worth mentioning about the stacks packaging changes.
No, I think you got the packaging stuff. Yeah, the security stuff. Did you already like started a draft PR on that?
Right. So I have a draft PR on what the initial thought was, what the initial design PR of yours suggested, which was to make stack requests, to make a distinction between stack requests and cluster stack requests, where one would govern, or where one would create cluster roles and the other one would create roles. But it seems the thinking has evolved a bit there, and you've updated that in your PR, and so now there's some thought that maybe RBAC doesn't need to be a user configurable thing at this point, that we know enough about a stack and a stack's dependencies that we can assert the correct RBAC roles. And there are some other changes in the design doc that you have open in your design PR. And so it's a matter of how much of those things do we want to incorporate into 03 or push to 04, and what all is going to rattle out in that design discussion.
Awesome. And then it sounds like that would be your primary focus, right? Like in the beginning of the sprint here is for,
Yes.
Converging the implementation with the design and trying to get those in a happy spot, convergence.
Yeah.
Cool.
Take the left hand and the right hand, combine them, and
yeah. And hopefully they meet in the middle.
right.
Awesome. Okay, so then let's so that's a full status update for what everyone is working on and the 0.3 release here as we're trying to converge and finish by the end of this sprint. I identified some of the risks here for the milestone. I see 2 fills on the call now. Did we double our fill productivity? That would be awesome. All right, I'm going to assume that's the plan of record going forward, 2 fills. All right, so the first risk on here is that we had wanted to update all of the infrastructure, cloud provider stacks to port their controllers to using the managed reconciler pattern. Some of those have been updated, but that is a lower priority than the resource connectivity functionality and user guide experience, et cetera. The porting of those controllers is a non-functional change. It does not have user impact. So it is a lower priority compared to the other ones. So I think that there's definitely going to be some of those controllers that do not get ported in the 0.3 milestone. The CICD pipeline examples. Phil, do you want to speak to that? Because I don't have a strong understanding of what what would be necessary to be able to do those sort of examples. I have a feeling, my gut feel is that that we don't necessarily have a good understanding of what's necessary there or where to focus our efforts. And the maturity of the milestone might be make it somewhat difficult to have true integration or to a high degree of integration that we're looking for. Can you make a comment on that, Phil? I don't hear you, but I also don't see that you're on mute either. Are you there now, Phil? Oh, we got 3 Phils now. This day is just getting, we're gonna go GA by next week if we keep increasing Phils here. Oh, we're back down to 2. All right, Phil, you could keep working on your audio there, and we'll try to sync up with you as soon as you get that back up to date. I have a feeling that you're working on getting the right microphone connected, since you have multiple microphones in your setup. All right, so we'll just move to the next item for now. The documentation and user guide updates, those are I declared those as a risk as well, because the scope of it is fairly broad and wide-reaching. We had Dan, Hashdan here drove an initiative a couple weeks ago around, getting a discussion going for what would be the entire overhaul of our documents, our documentation user guides would be. They've been in the same state that they've been in since the initial, taking the repo public back in 2018, 0.1 release was. So there's a whole lot of improvements that we identified there that we'd like to kind of, incorporate and improve overall the entire document and user guide, initial experience, et cetera. So the scope is kind of broad, but we do have the right attention and resources on that as well, that as each engineer that owns one of the cloud provider stacks finishes their networking connectivity, that will be a main focus for them, is updating the user guides and making sure that is a smooth experience. So we have the right resources on it, but scoping it to the set of attainable changes that makes some measurable improvements and progress forward for the guides is going to be the right call to go here. Phil, are you look like I see your face now. Do you have audio now?
I do, yes.
Yes.
My monitor tried to steal everything, audio and mic, and it was not able to do that. So.
Do you want to make a comment on the CICD pipeline examples?
Yeah, so I think that those are just hanging out at the moment. And so when we get time to put some attention towards that, that would be good. But
do we have a good understanding of what the deliverable is, or what would be the strategy, or like what we want to accomplish? I know in general we do, but like, do you have any thoughts about the specifics of what we want to accomplish there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that issue goes into a bit of detail on that. But the basics are, pipeline examples for like Jenkins, pipeline examples for GitLab standard, and then like a GitOps example with maybe like Weaveworks. And so what that would look like is effectively kind of like a getting started, doc that says, hey, like here's 3 popular forms of CICD, and this is basically what it looks like to use Crossplane in each of those environments. So it just involves kind of maybe getting the WordPress example or another Hello World example kind of in a repo, and then kind of building so that users can follow along with that and get started more quickly.
What do you think about like the scope of work for those? Is that like something that's like low-hanging fruit, or is it kind of require a fair amount of coordination, integration, ramping up, like, getting things submitted to external repos or anything like that?
Oh, no, I think it's something that could be entirely self-contained in the Crossplane repo. And it's literally just, like here's, what your pipeline looks like, for a standard pipeline in Jenkins. And then this is, the 1, or 2 commands that you drop in a script, and here's what the scripts look like, or here's the individual Crossplane commands that you can drop in to do the integration. So I think that would be pretty straight ahead to do. Okay,
that sounds good. Yeah, it definitely is. I would identify it still as a risk since it hasn't been addressed yet. And, the updating our user guides, documentation, I'd say is probably a higher priority than that, since it's so user facing and the primary experience that people have with Crossplane.
Yep.
So I'd say definitely declare it still as a risk. The blog post I thought was kind of a risk as well, because we had intended to have a blog post per epic, but a lot of these epics are all being delivered at the end of the milestone, which, I start to wonder the value of like 5 blog posts all in the same day versus, a single blog post that kind of, for the release or, for 0.3 focus that kind of touches on all the topics instead of having individual blog posts, all at the same time. And I think that would want to do a retrospective about how can we improve that process where we have blog posts, throughout the milestone on a regular recurring cadence, instead of, all coming in at the end. So I think that, it'd be good to, keep the excitement, keep the momentum, showing that we're making progress, et cetera, throughout the milestones, and being able to have, posts to share with the community and the user base in the middle of the milestone. And we'll need to do a retrospective on that.
Yeah, totally. And we were discussing that a little bit last week, towards the end of the week. And the thinking was we could do a blog post that kind of announced, 0.3 and, kind of like covered all the aspects, like not in any great depth. A lot of that will be in the updated kind of vision doc or whatever. And so it'll just kind of call out the highlights and maybe kind of announce that it's available. And then here's where you can go to learn more. But then still wanting to do those more in-depth blog posts and potentially having those go out as like a follow-on to the announcement that kind of dives into a little bit more detail.
Oh, yeah. Yep, that makes sense. Cool. Okay, so that was everything that I had on the milestone itself. Just to recap here, there are a lot of items that are still in the milestone. A lot of them are epics. A lot of them are in review right now as well for the cloud provider stacks and their resource connectivity such. There are some items of risk that we've called out here, but in general, we are converging towards being able to release. I'm hoping that with a big push here on getting the resource connectivity into master, to updating the stacks manager with the final the security model, et cetera, and then a huge pass and push on the user guides and documentation and experience for Crossplane, that will have a solid 0.3 to put out, hopefully, on the time frame that we were hoping for as well at the end of next week. All right, so I wanted to give a quick update on the stacks, the cloud provider stacks themselves. So all 3 cloud provider stacks exist now. They all have their separate repos. All functionality has been split out into those individual repositories. And I have links here for little install guides if you want to take those for a test run right now. There's a note here that because the main Crossplane repo has not been updated yet to remove the cloud providers from that repo, if you wanted to test out these stacks for a particular cloud provider, then you'd need to install Crossplane from source locally from a fork that has the cloud providers removed. That will obviously not be a requirement at the end of the milestone, but if you want early testing and to take these cloud provider stacks for a little test spin, then you will need to build and install Crossplane from source right now. The next step is the official build pipelines via Jenkins, et cetera, to do builds on every commit to master and publish the new updated stack to a registry. And that is my primary focus right now. And so that will, when we have that up and running as well, then we'd be able to go ahead and remove this cloud provider functionality from main Crossplane repo and switch over cleanly to using the new stacks as the main experience for consuming cloud provider functionality in Crossplane. Phil, did you want to speak about this issue here about resource claim portability deficiencies and improvements? Note that let's try to keep it at a high level here. And if we want to go into a deeper technical conversation, we can reserve that time for at the end of the call.
Oh yeah, totally. So at a super high level, we basically, had behavior before that allowed you to have like portable claims and then do class of service selection using kind of the name of the generic claim, generic class kind. And so that was really great. So then it's like an app owner, I can come in and kind of pick from a self-service menu of, classes of service that like an admin might populate into my Crossplane instance. And so we basically made a set of enhancements that were really awesome for strongly typed resource classes that make it a lot easier to create new resource classes and have strong validation and attach annotations to that. And then claim policies, which are a much needed step in the policy-driven direction for specifying like defaults and then having more sophisticated policies going forward. But one of the side effects of strongly typed is that it made the class ref in a claim bound to a specific provider like GCP or AWS. And so if you omit that class ref, then you can rely on the single default class of service that like the administrators created for you in your namespace. And so what this proposal does is says, if we were to add or probably even replace class ref now that we're strongly typed with a policy ref, then we get the level of indirection to the ClaimKind without being bound to a specific provider by the class ref's API version and kind. And so it basically kind of keeps that capability to both have portability for the app owner as well as allowing them to select the class of service that they want from the available classes of service that an administrator has created in an environment.
Right, so this is essentially like an indirection of in a resource claim, you'd be pointing at a policy as opposed to a particular class, but that policy itself points to a class, so it's kind of an indirection abstraction.
Right, so this used to be handled all in kind of the generic resource class because there was a single one, and so since it was generic, it served both as kind of like a generic way of referring to a class of service. And then when we introduced strongly typed, it basically pushed out the strong typing all the way to the claim. Mm-hmm. And so, basically just pulling it back to that middle ground, which is basically the ClaimKind, and that's the portable ClaimKind. And so it's I think a fairly straight ahead change, but just something that I would probably want to discuss in more detail, maybe async on the Slack.
Right. And Dan, do you have a comment about the scope of this? I saw that you took a look at this proposal from Phil here. Do you have a comment on the scope of it?
Yep, absolutely. So there's a thread in Slack, and it might be worth me adding another comment that had my kind of additional comments in there that I made in Slack, because what I added was just a very simple thing, as you can see there. But essentially what this would look like in terms of implementation is adding a provider ref on claim types, which would be updating the embedded claim spec that comes from Crossplane runtime. So we would just update that with a like a core v1 object reference, a Kubernetes object reference, and that would be the provider ref, just like there's a class ref, and it would be optional. And then it would also involve updating the default class reconcilers to, instead of looking for a single policy in a namespace, and if there's more than one saying, I can't reconcile this, there can only be one policy in this namespace, it would look for a set, well, if it gave a provider reference on the claim, it would look for that provider reference, or that, policy reference in that namespace. And if it omitted a policy reference, then we would have this kind of label on one of the policies that would say this is the default if no policy is specified. And that would allow you to still get that omission of a class ref and a policy ref and just fall back on whatever the administrator has defined.
Got it. So you could still end up with a complete default of just give me MySQL. I'm not going to care about any details at all. My administrator set up some defaults for me. Just use that.
Yeah, exactly. And it actually turns out really, really well. And Phil had a great proposal there of doing this in a simple way, because essentially what policies do are they're taking that kind of like class of service and just creating it as a middle layer as opposed to having it integrated into the resource class. So we get all the benefits of the strongly typed resource classes while also being able to have these classes of service. And so you can define with a policy, this is what my Postgres large instance is, and you can change that around without deleting all of the resource classes you have. So let's say you have a Cloud SQL class and a Cloud SQL Postgres, a RDS Postgres, and you can basically decide which one of those is your large without deleting and recreating a new one that has the name Postgres large or something like that. So I think it's a much better kind of like stronger reference pattern there. So yeah, I think this is a really good proposal.
Cool. That's yeah. I think that something that may be beneficial here is that it seems to be somewhat scoped in the implementation. That it's not a massive change to be able to incorporate this, and it seems like it would improve the user experience as well. Because we were kind of relying on defaulting to kind of take care of a lot of the experience for us in 0.3. So it sounds like something we should still consider taking in for 0.3. But I think, yeah, we can continue that conversation async in the issue here. And Dan, if you had any more comments that you had on Slack there to capture them here in the issue so it's all in the same context, that would be really useful.
Absolutely. And one other thing I wanted to mention is this is one of the big benefits of breaking out into Crossplane runtime, and that these are embedded fields that are embedded in all the different claims or all of the different policy types, and just making that update once in Crossplane runtime and bumping the dependency version, then we get all of that built in. And you can imagine how that could look across specific, managed resource classes as well across stacks. So that's pretty cool functionality we get from that.
Cool, agreed. All right, so let's go ahead to the next item here. Glenn, it looks like you were able to join here in time for the agenda item that you added in. Do you want to speak to this real quick, Glenn?
Yeah, it is a brief one. I just wanted to raise the kind of issue that the way a stack is represented on a registry affects the CLI's ability to do image relocation. And I think one or two people have been looking at this, but I just wanted to kind of float it in the call just to bring up the whole topic, because at the moment the stack is a kind of stack on the registry is a kind of blob, which isn't really easy to introspect in the CLI. The way this has been done elsewhere in the CNAB work is to use a index, OCI index, to hold metadata and annotations, so then you can kind of grab that information through the distribution API and get hold of it very easily. Didn't want to get into much more detail than that, really. Just wanted to make people aware of that so that we don't necessarily go down the blob route and never be able to come back.
I added some comments in Slack that I should probably move to GitHub here, but the link that he provided, that Glenn provided there, the CNAB to OCI, somewhere in there they reference the OCI spec about annotations, and that does look very suitable for what app YAML is doing. The comments that I added in Slack were essentially that while the app YAML file may be useful for a developer to be able to annotate their stack, the stack CLI tool could perhaps be the broker there and convert that app YAML data that as Glenn was saying, that data that's stored inside the image, it could float that up to a higher level where the distribution, is distribution the right word there? Where the
registry API.
Yeah, where the registry API can take those annotations and apply that, and it would be searchable at a higher level. So essentially the stack CLI could take that app YAML data, and instead of including it in a deep layer, it could push the image and then use commands. The equivalent Docker command is like Docker manifest, Docker, was it experimental? Docker manifest annotate, and then you provide the annotation there. And in Docker, it says it's an experimental feature, but it's part of the OCI spec, and there's a bunch of annotations that are part of, opencontainer.org, a bunch of like pre-registered annotations that kind of fit almost field for field what we've got in app YAML. So it's certainly interesting. It's certainly something to dig into.
Yeah, I think it's very useful to have that, indexing or annotations, metadata, availability in the, distribution layer or on the OCI registries there. So that's definitely really useful. That's thank you for sharing that link and information, Glenn. I think that's going to be definitely come in handy.
Yeah. I mean, it will make more sense later on when we start to get into this. But while I'm here, I mean, I've been finding it a bit tricky to find the way stacks are built, because the sample stack, the database one, whatever it was, I forget, seems to have kind of withered a bit. And the other stacks are kind of in flight. So it's probably a bad time to kind of come into this because everything's on the move. But in due course, it'd be good to kind of have a component that builds stacks in a standard way. And then I could submit a PR to that or whatever to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, that does definitely make a lot of sense, Glenn. And having that logic in a normalized, sane way, so that functionality like this can be added in a unified normal way as well. It makes a lot of sense. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
And Glenn, I'm not sure if I missed it, but is there an example of the metadata that the CNAB stuff is doing for the OCI index that we could use as a reference? I don't know if you dropped a link in to that, or if that was just embedded in the issue.
Let me provide an example in that issue. That would be helpful.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
Awesome. So then in the PR section, we got a status update for all the cloud provider, resource connectivity, stack, etc. PRs. Dan, did you have more that you wanted to make a comment on for this Azure PR, or did we already cover it?
No, we already covered it.
Excellent. Okay. All right. So that was the end of the agenda here. Were there any other items that folks wanted to bring up right now? Okay, if there are no further agenda items, then we can go ahead and adjourn for the week. Quick summary here. We are driving the 0.3 release in this sprint here. So by the time we have our next community meeting in 2 weeks, we are hoping to get the 0.3 release out into the hands of the community and user base. And we are converging on all the resource connectivity improvements for each of the individual cloud providers, and hoping to get those merged to master very shortly. We have individual stacks for each cloud provider, so you can install only a single cloud provider if that's all you're interested in. And the other functionality like the Stack CLI and Stack Manager improvements are converging as well. So the big push after the next few days here of getting code changes done will be on user guides, documentation, experience, etc., so that we find bugs, find integration issues, and get our guide user experience up to snuff for a polished 0.3 release before the next community meeting. So if that's all the agenda items covered here, then I think we can adjourn for this week. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jared.